Once upon a time, in a small village called Nodu, known far and wide for its beautiful women and handsome men, there lived a young woman named Helen. Helen's beauty was something no one could put into words. Her hair was very long and soft, her eyes as lovely as the clear blue skies, and everywhere she went, people admired her deeply. But Helen was not only beautiful, she was also very stubborn and followed her heart passionately. She was the type of woman who would ignore the advice of everyone around her if her heart told her differently, even if it meant leading herself into trouble. Her parents often worried about her stubbornness and questioned her, but Helen always believed strongly that her heart would never lead her astray. One fateful day, Helen was walking through the market square with her best friend Emily when she saw a very handsome and charming man who seemed different from all the men she had ever seen in the village. The man was tall and mysterious, with striking grey eyes and skin as smooth and beautiful as a woman's. "Who is that?" Helen asked Emily, pointing towards the man. Emily smiled and replied, "That is Thomas. He recently came to our village. He lives at the edge of the village, and there are rumors everywhere about how rich he is. He bought a very large piece of land inside the forest at the village's edge and built a huge mansion there." Helen found herself deeply drawn to Thomas, and when their eyes met, it felt like true love at first sight. Her heart started beating faster whenever she was near Thomas, and with every conversation they shared, she found herself falling deeper and deeper in love with him. Thomas was a wonderful storyteller who had many exciting tales about his adventurous and wealthy life. He often bought expensive gifts for Helen and treated her like a princess. Many times, Thomas would sing to her with his beautiful voice, and it didn't take long before Helen fell hopelessly in love with him and started a relationship. However, Helen's parents were very uncomfortable with their daughter's relationship. "Helen, this man is a stranger. Please be careful," her father warned her. "We know nothing about this man's past, and his wealth does not promise happiness." Her mother often said, "There's something strange and unnatural about him." But Helen refused to listen. Her love and affection for Thomas were already deeply rooted in her heart. When Thomas asked for her hand in marriage, she quickly agreed without any hesitation, ignoring her father's advice and her mother's warnings. The wedding between Thomas and Helen was even more strange. There was plenty of food and drink for everyone, and the leftover food could have fed the entire village for 2 more days. Yet, unlike other weddings the villagers had witnessed, none of Thomas's siblings, family, or relatives came. Helen's parents wanted to ask Thomas about this, but Helen lied to them, saying Thomas told her he was an orphan. After their grand wedding, Thomas took Helen to his mansion at the edge of the forest. The house was strangely quiet and calm. The walls were very dusty, with picture frames of strange-looking people hanging everywhere. They all seemed like newly married husbands. Thomas carried Helen gently like a child into the bedroom and placed her softly on the bed. Unlike the other rooms in the house, this room was neat and beautifully decorated with red candles and lovely flowers placed everywhere. Helen looked at Thomas with a smile as they made love for the first time that night. Afterward, Thomas looked at Helen with soft eyes and held her hand. "I love you, Helen, but there's something I must tell you," Thomas said gently. "What is it?" Helen asked. But before Thomas could open his mouth to speak, the door to the room flew open suddenly, and a thick, strange wind blew out all the candles. Suddenly, 2 huge men entered the room. Their faces could not be seen clearly because of the darkness. Without saying a word, they grabbed Thomas. Thomas tried desperately to push them away and struggled hard to break free, but the strength of those 2 huge men was not normal. "I love you so much, Helen. I'm so sorry. Please Thomas cried out with a breaking voice. But the 2 huge men dragged him away before he could finish his sentence. Helen became extremely shocked and confused. She didn't know what to do. When she finally regained her senses, she ran out of the room, screaming Thomas's name with a voice trembling in fear. "Thomas, where are you?" she shouted at the top of her voice as she searched every room in the mansion. After searching the entire house without seeing him, she went outside into the forest, still dressed in her wedding gown, which was the only clothing she had brought with her to his house. She walked into the forest, calling Thomas's name loudly. Fortunately, she found a trail on the ground that looked as if something or someone had been dragged along the path. Carefully, she followed the trail while continuing to call out Thomas's name. As Helen went deeper into the forest following the trail, she soon became lost and no longer knew where she was or how to go back home. She looked around the forest, feeling confused, when suddenly she saw white smoke rising far away. The smoke indicated someone was either burning or cooking something. Helen followed the smoke carefully and closely until she arrived at a strange, small hut hidden within the thick forest. There was a fire outside the hut with a pot of food boiling on it. Helen didn't know what to do. She walked slowly towards the hut. "Hello," she said softly, but no one answered. She moved closer to the hut and was about to look inside when suddenly she heard a voice from behind her. "Your husband is not in my hut," an old, strange woman said to her. Helen quickly turned around to see a very old woman with wrinkles covering her face. She was holding a stick to support herself, but something about the old woman was very unusual. Although her skin was old and sagging, her hair was black, fresh, and very long, like that of a young woman. The old woman sat on a stool beside the fire and opened the pot that was cooking. Helen suddenly became very frightened when she saw what was inside the pot. It was the hands and legs of a baby boiling in fresh blood. Helen watched in horror as the strange old woman poured some of the blood onto her hand and tasted it as though it was a normal meal. When the old woman was done, she looked up at Helen again and said, "My child, your husband, Thomas, is not of this physical world. Thomas is a spirit, a soul caught between life and death. His soul is restless and seeks peace." Helen couldn't believe what she was hearing. She shook her head, unable to accept what the old woman was telling her, even though she wondered how this strange old woman knew her husband was missing and even knew his name. "No. I refuse to believe you. Your words cannot be true. I felt his warmth on our wedding night, and I saw his tears of joy on our wedding day," Helen said with determination. "Child, listen to me carefully," the old woman continued. "Your husband, Thomas, was killed by his own brother, who was jealous of Thomas's wealth and riches. He killed Thomas and hid his body inside this cursed forest. Thomas's soul is not at peace because the evil spirits and ghosts in this forest constantly torment him." Helen asked, still confused, "Then how did he come to my village, become my friend for months, and remain with me until our wedding night? The dead can act like the living if no one knows they are dead. His body may not have been real, but his love for you was very real. His time in this world is almost over. That is why the spirit snatched him away from you. Thomas is in great pain, and if you wish to save his soul, you must journey into the spirit world to rescue him," the old woman explained in a serious tone. "If you don't do this, Thomas would be in pain forever, and he would never find peace," the old woman said. Helen kept quiet for a while, thinking deeply about all that the old woman had told her. Her heart was filled with fear, confusion, and uncertainty. She didn't know what to do. She remembered the beautiful times she had shared with Thomas, how caring, romantic, and loving he had always been to her. Then she recalled his last words and the deep pain in his voice when those two men dragged him away. After thinking for a while, Helen decided she would do whatever it took to save Thomas's soul. She turned to face the strange old woman and asked firmly, "What must I do to save his soul and grant him peace?" The old woman smiled softly, stood up, and walked inside her hut. A few seconds later, She returned holding a small compass and a tiny bottle filled with a strange glowing liquid. She handed them both to Helen and said, "If you drink this, it will take you into the spirit world. But you must be very careful. The spirit world is very different from the human world and is filled with danger. You must find Thomas's soul before sunrise, or you will be trapped in the spirit world forever. This compass can feel your heart's desire, and it will lead you directly to where Thomas is." The old woman's words scared Helen deeply, but her love for Thomas was stronger than her fear. She was ready to do anything to free his soul. Without thinking twice, she opened the bottle and quickly drank the glowing liquid. As soon as she drank it, the world around her started to change. The trees began twisting into strange shapes, and the air became thick and heavy. The strange old woman and her hut slowly faded away, and Helen found herself in a completely different world. She saw many people walking around, but their faces were disfigured, and some were terrifying. Some had no head, while others had knives stuck deep in their chests. Helen quickly understood she was now in the spirit world, and the people she saw were spirits and ghosts. Her heart started beating very fast, and she was filled with overwhelming fear. But she quickly calmed herself and followed the direction the compass pointed. Helen walked and walked until she arrived at a wide red river, which looked like it was filled with blood. At the riverbank was a boat with a ferryman standing beside it. Helen looked at the compass and saw that it was directing her to the other side of the river. She approached the ferryman, who was an old man with a large potbelly. "To cross to the other side, you must pay a fee." "What do you have to trade?" he asked. Helen was confused and looked around, realizing she had no money. Suddenly, the ferryman pointed at her finger, where she wore the expensive diamond ring Thomas had given her on their wedding day. "I can accept that jewelry as payment," he said. Helen felt very sad and hurt because it was the last thing she had from Thomas. But she had no choice and gave the ring to the ferryman. He smiled and allowed her into the boat. "Are you sure you want to cross to the other side? Many people who go there never return. It is extremely dangerous on the other side." "Will you still go?" he asked, trying to discourage her. But Helen replied with a firm voice, "I will cross." The ferryman nodded and began rowing her across the river of blood. When they reached halfway, Helen suddenly saw countless hands rising from inside the river. They started grabbing the boat, trying to pull it down. Helen grew even more scared. Seeing what was happening, the ferryman shouted urgently at her, "Close your eyes and be courageous. They can smell your fear. Harden your heart and be determined, or they will pull this boat into the river." Helen quickly closed her eyes and filled her mind with thoughts of Thomas to drive away the fear. When she did this, the hands disappeared back into the river, and the ferryman safely took the boat to the other side. On the other side of the river was a thick forest filled with twisted, evil-looking trees that spoke with strange voices. The ferryman said, "This forest is called the Forest of Echoes. It is a place where trees whisper the fears, doubts, and regrets of those who enter. I can tell you are from the human world. Be careful, and I wish you good luck in finding what you came for." After saying this, the ferryman rowed his boat away, leaving Helen all alone. Helen followed the compass and bravely entered the forest. As she walked, she started hearing whispers and voices that sounded exactly like her mother, father, and best friend Emily. They whispered terrible things: "You will fail. He is gone forever. You are not strong enough. This journey will end you. This forest will swallow you alive, Helen. Thomas cannot be saved." Helen's heart began to tremble, and fear quickly filled her heart. But then she remembered the words of the ferryman and began to sing loudly one of the songs Thomas always sang to her, trying to drown out the terrifying whispers from the forest. She walked as fast as her legs could carry her, closely following the direction of the compass until she arrived at a strange estate filled with many houses. Helen walked slowly into the estate. It was very quiet and deserted, yet all the houses were incredibly beautiful. After she took a few steps forward, the doors to all the houses suddenly opened. Inside, Helen could see scenes from different times of her life. In one house, she saw her past, her wedding day with Thomas, and how joyful she looked. Suddenly, Thomas appeared in front of the house, stretching his hand towards her. "Helen, hold my hand and come inside," Thomas said gently. In another house, she saw her childhood, when she was very young and happy. Standing in front of that house was her best friend Emily, holding out her hand and asking Helen to return to the past. But Helen knew these were tricks meant to distract her. She quickly covered her ears with her hands and walked fast through the estate without looking into any of the houses again. When Helen finally left the strange estate, she found herself standing at the entrance of a dark cave. She was terrified to enter, even though the compass was pointing directly inside. Suddenly, she heard Thomas's voice from deep inside the cave, screaming and crying in pain and agony. Without thinking twice, Helen bravely entered the dark cave. Inside, she saw an old lamp hanging on the wall. She quickly took it and walked deeper into the cave, using the dim light to guide her way. After walking for a while, she reached the center of the cave, which was very wide, bright, and large. In the middle, she saw Thomas tied with chains to a huge rock that looked like an altar. "Helen," Thomas said in a weak voice as soon as he saw her. "Yes, my love, it's me," Helen quickly answered, tears streaming down her face as she rushed to unchain him. But before she could reach Thomas, an evil witch with fiery red eyes and very long white hair appeared suddenly in front of her. "You foolish child! Your mother and father warned you, but you refused to listen. What power do you have that makes you exceptional?" the witch growled angrily. Helen was filled with terror, but then she remembered the riddle that the strange old woman had told her earlier, and she instantly knew what she must say. Summoning all her courage, she moved closer to the witch and said boldly, "Love is powerful, but true love is unstoppable. The love I have for him is what makes me exceptional." The witch stared at Helen with intense anger and moved closer, sniffing around Helen's body, trying to scare her. But Helen held back her fear and showed courage. Suddenly, the witch looked directly into Helen's eyes and smiled, saying, "Truly, true love conquers all. If you loved him deeply enough to risk your life by coming into the spirit world, then who am I to stop you from saving him?" After saying this, the witch vanished. Helen quickly ran to where Thomas was chained and began to free him before the sun could rise. As soon as she unchained him, Thomas fell weakly to the ground and apologized to Helen for not telling her the truth about himself earlier. He placed his hand on her chest and softly said, "Thank you for saving me. I will always be with you, and I will never stop loving you. Please, go to my village. It is called Judah, located in the east of Aram. Your compass will guide you there. Find my brother, tell everyone the truth, and avenge my death." As soon as Thomas said those words, the sun rose, and the first ray of sunlight pierced through the spirit world. The cave slowly transformed back into the physical world. Thomas's spirit began to fade away, and Helen fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. When Helen woke up many hours later, she found herself lying in the middle of the forest, with the sun high up in the sky. She slowly stood up and looked around, realizing she was back in the physical world. Suddenly, she remembered the last words of Thomas's spirit before it disappeared. Quickly, she checked around her and found the compass the strange old woman had given her earlier. The compass was now pointing in a new direction. With great determination in her heart, Helen began her journey to Judah, the village of Thomas. She walked and walked for days, surviving on wild fruits she found in the forest. After 7 long days of traveling, Helen finally arrived at a small and ancient village hidden among the hills. As she walked into the village, she saw an old woman carrying a large bundle of firewood on her head. Feeling pity for the old woman, Helen greeted her kindly and offered to help carry the heavy firewood. The old woman gratefully handed the firewood to Helen, and together they walked slowly to the old woman's house. When they reached the house, Helen gently placed the firewood in a corner of the compound. The old woman thanked her warmly and prayed for her. Just as Helen was about to leave, the old woman said sadly, "If only my son Thomas was still alive, I'm sure you would have made a very good wife for him." Helen was shocked by the old woman's words. She quickly turned around and asked with surprise, "You have a son named Thomas?" "Yes," the old woman replied sadly. "He was very handsome and also very successful, but he went missing many years ago, and since then, he has never been found." Helen immediately remembered the words of the strange old woman she met in the forest, who told her that Thomas's brother had killed him out of greed and envy. Then Helen asked the old woman, "Does your son have a brother?" "Yes, he does. His name is Andrew. After his older brother went missing, he took over all his wealth and threw the rest of the family out of the house. If my Thomas were alive, I'm sure I wouldn't be living in such a small, old hut," the old woman explained with tears in her eyes. Helen felt deeply touched by the old woman's words. She then decided to tell the old woman about everything she had been through, or how Thomas came to her village, how they got married, how he was dragged away on their wedding night, how she met the strange old woman, and how she journeyed into the spirit world to save Thomas's soul. Finally, Helen revealed that Andrew, the old woman's younger son, was the one responsible for Thomas's death. At first, the old woman couldn't believe her ears. She thought Helen was lying until Helen described everything she knew about Thomas, what he looked like and how kind and compassionate he was. Hearing all this, the old woman broke down and wept bitterly. Filled with anger and grief, she took Helen straight to the elders of the village and told them everything Helen had said. The elders of the village became very furious. Immediately, they summoned Andrew to the king's palace and demanded that he swear an oath to prove he had nothing to do with Thomas's disappearance. When Andrew arrived at the palace, he was shocked by all that Helen had revealed. He was even more surprised that she knew exactly how he had killed Thomas. Realizing that his evil deeds had caught up with him, Andrew understood that swearing an oath of innocence would mean certain death. Overwhelmed by guilt and fear, Andrew fell to his knees in front of the king and the elders and confessed all his sins openly. He told them he had killed Thomas out of envy because Thomas was very successful and wealthy while he was still struggling to make something of himself. He explained that one night, he invited Thomas to his house and poisoned his food. After Thomas died, he threw his body into the forbidden forest because humans were not allowed to enter it, and no one would find him there. Hearing this, the king became very angry. He immediately stripped Andrew of all his power and wealth, ordering his guards to break the bones in Andrew's legs and throw him into the same cursed forest where he had dumped Thomas's body, as punishment for his wicked crime. The entire village thanked Helen for her courage and bravery. They gave her plenty of food, water, and a horse to take her safely back to her own village. After 10 long days of traveling, Helen finally reached her village. She was tired and exhausted from the journey. Her parents and best friend, Emily, were overjoyed to see her again. Ever since she had left with Thomas after their marriage, they had been desperately searching for her. When they couldn't find her or even Thomas's mansion, which had mysteriously disappeared from the forest, they became deeply worried, not knowing what to do. Now that she was home, they welcomed her back warmly and thanked God for bringing her home safely. 2 months later, Helen discovered she was pregnant with Thomas's child. She felt very strange and confused because she knew Thomas had been a spirit. She couldn't understand how it was possible for him to get her pregnant. Yet, after some months, Helen gave birth to a healthy baby boy who looked exactly like Thomas, her spirit husband. She refused to marry any other man. Instead, she dedicated the rest of her life to raising her son and honoring Thomas's memory, the man she had loved so deeply. Although Helen was deeply hurt, she found joy and comfort in her child and in the knowledge that Thomas's spirit was finally at peace. The moral lesson of this story reminds us that true love endures all, even in the face of death. Justice might be delayed, but it will always prevail in the end. Greed and betrayal lead only to destruction, while courage and determination can overcome any challenge or obstacle. True love leaves a legacy that lasts forever.